Good morning, everyone. It's still morning. Hope you're all coffeeed up. And I certainly am myself. And what I want to do is talk with you about forecasting. And by forecasting, we just mean thinking probabilistically about an uncertain future. And in that sense, kind of every decision we make is a forecast. We're taking an action or making a decision that we think will improve the odds of getting our desired outcome. And we do two other things with that at Good Judgment. One is we want to use numbers to think probabilistically. Just like in weather, just like in sport, we can apply probabilities to better understand these uncertain events and quantify them, for reasons I'll show in just a minute. And the other part we use is to use crowdsourced techniques. A wisdom of the crowd approach delivers a superior forecast than any one individual over time. And what I'd like to do in a moment is as an exercise, a forecasting exercise. So I invite you on your phones to go to delfinio.com. You can put in a pretend email address, it doesn't matter. The main thing is to put in that code that you see there, KCF9W. And our firm came out of a US government research project that went on for 4 years, and it was in the wake of some significant forecast failures on the part of the intelligence community. And so they were doing very genuine, deep soul searching to find ways to improve the skills of their intelligence analysts. And they ran a competition with 4 university-based teams. The one that won decisively was called Good Judgment, led by Phil Tetlock at Wharton and Barb Mellers. And this just shows that how the research teams were supposed to improve on the wisdom of the crowd. That was the baseline on a whole series, hundreds of questions on geopolitical and macroeconomic events. Who will win this election? What will GDP be in China next year? These sorts of things. And the Good Judgment team knocked the cover off the ball in the first year, the second year, and in the second 2 years, the government shut it down because they saw that the results of the Good Judgment team was really phenomenal, and they wanted to see what other sorts of tools and techniques they could devise. And it was all written up in this book, came out a couple of years ago, Super Forecasting. Great book, still in print, and the research still goes on. And what I want to do with you is give you kind of a crash course in how to apply the steps. It's a process to improve your forecast accuracy as an individual, as a team, as an organization. And hopefully you're in, and when you should see this question. It's an important question. This is one that came from the government here. Before January of 2024, will China and the Gulf Cooperation Council complete a free trade agreement? And maybe you know a lot about this, maybe you don't know much at all, doesn't matter. Just for purposes of trying it out, just please put in a number, and you'll put in a 0 if you don't think there's any chance of that occurring, like there's no chance it'll rain next weekend. You'll put in 100 if you're absolutely sure it will happen, but probabilistically you'll put something somewhere in between. And I'll just leave it up for a few minutes while you have a chance to put in a number. So this remains the dominant way that forecasting is done, is with words, with language. And the problem with language is that it can be very imprecise. We can all interpret it different ways. It can be very noisy. It can also mean that you don't really know what is being forecast, as in this example from the World Economic Forum from a few years ago, where they made a forecast in their global risks report. Arguably, cohesiveness of the multilateral system could be weakened, but it's also possible that increased density could bolster. I challenge you to distill this down into an understandable forecast. And it's been a few years since then, and as we look back in time, were they right? Were they wrong? We can't really know, because it sounds profound, but it doesn't really tell us something specific that we can understand and evaluate. And you can look at any of their reports. They all have a lot of examples of this sort. It's far better to use numbers and be precise, because the ambiguity that can be conveyed by words is huge. So the word maybe, for instance, academics have gone and done surveys asking people in context, what number do you assign to the word maybe, right? And it ranges from 22 to 89%. So the wonderful thing is no matter what happens, you can say maybe, and if it happens, you said see, and if it doesn't, you say, oh, I only said maybe. And there are lots of such words. Distinct possibility being my favorite. If you see that, run away, because it's not going to be a very useful forecast for you. Instead, we want to use numbers. And that's the kind of thing we do with the Dubai Future Foundation, where they've got a training program for civil servants here, for the Future Experts program. And as part of that, they have a super forecasting module. And as part of that, they do forecasts, and they come up with questions that they pose that they think are of consequence for the government and the region. And so that's where this question comes from. And why don't we see what the results are? And you'll see on your devices that the range is 0 to 100. So we have the full gamut here in this room. And the wisdom of the crowd says the probability of that occurring is about 60%. So we've just did a wisdom of the crowd. And if I had nothing else to go on, I'd say that's pretty good. I'm going to go with it. And that's where a lot of organizations and people will stop. That's basically where we start. And the question over on our public site that the participants in the program are forecasting, they actually have a number that's a fair amount lower. Just 36% is the wisdom of the crowd in the DFF Future Experts program. Okay, yeah, and as they go through the program, we see very dramatic improvements in their results, in their critical thinking, and in their forecasting accuracy. So it's a process, and every process will have a nice checklist. And here are a few things I suggest that you want to have on your checklist as you think about your teams and your organizations. The first is to start with what they call a base rate. And what usually happens when we're confronted with a question about the future is we'll zero in on that particular item. So like a wager, most of you, when you thought about that question, you were thinking about the headlines and the personalities involved and what's going on at the moment. What's a better initial step to do is take a step back and say, how often do things like this occur? How often are there international agreements of that sort? How often are there agreements between the Gulf Cooperation Council and major outside countries? And so what we want to do is look for how do things like this usually go, and then ask, how is this one different? Rather than starting, well, this time is different. That's a conclusion to be proved, not an assumption to start with. So an example that we use a lot is if you happen to be at a wedding and be next to a good forecaster and they ask you, so what's the odds that this particular marriage will last? Here's an example of the former royal couple, and they've managed to stay in the headlines and stay relevant for quite some time. But the question you might ask yourself is not, well, how happy they are and how wonderful the wedding was, but instead, if you have the worst luck to go to 100 weddings and come back in a few years, how many of them will have lasted? And the answer is going to be, in the case of the UK, maybe 50%. And that's the place you start. And then you start going into the particulars of the situation. Same thing with mergers and anything you can think of. It's better to try and find a comparison class. It can be tough. They might be rare. They might be hard to find. But you're going to start with a better initial number and then update. The second really important thing to do is to write down your thinking. Why is it you're attaching the probability you are? And that does a lot of good things. One is it crystallizes your thinking and forces you to kind of surface some hidden assumptions that might be in there. It also lets you go back when the event occurs or does not and see how your reasoning aligned with reality. If you don't do that, when something happens, people will often tend to say, well, I kind of knew it all the time. What they call that hindsight bias. And you can see it in real time too. When big things are unfolding and there's a lot of uncertainty, once it resolves, once we know what's happening, whether it's a US election or conflict in Ukraine, it's kind of like, well, we knew it all the time. How could you have missed that? This is the way to avoid that risk of hindsight bias. And there's a great quote from Daniel Kahneman in a biography about him that came out a couple of years ago. And it says, no one ever made a decision because of a number. They need a story. What's the context for the probability estimate that you're making? And that's a way to help communicate to decision makers too. Third step that fits in from the second is that you can then compare your reasoning with your team, with others. We all have limited information, imperfect understanding of what the future is going to hold. And the more views that you can bring in to the discussion, ideally anonymously, the better results you're going to have. Because we all have small pieces of the mosaic. If you bring us a piece of the mosaic and someone else brings a piece of the mosaic and we fill it in, we get a much better picture faster. And the great way to do that is by doing it anonymously so that we don't anchor on high status individuals. They call this the Delphi method, pioneered by Rand Corporation years ago, very effective tool. And it mitigates a lot of groupthink risks that Phil Tetlock writes about in the book. Step 4 is update, right? So a lot of people think when they make a forecast, it's good to be one and done, you move on. To the contrary, it's really important as someone makes a more persuasive argument or there's something new that occurs in the headlines that you update your thinking and bring that into your forecast. If I know nothing else other than people are making updates, I'm going to put more weight on their forecast because they're going to be bringing in more recent information. It's going to be a better number just by updating alone. We have data on that too. We ran a competition a few years ago with some finance professionals and then saw how the updating affected the accuracy. Just making one update more than doubled the accuracy. Making 2 updates and 3 updates, even more. And then step 5 here is keep score. Get the feedback. When something occurs and you've been assigning probabilities along the way, what you want to know is how accurate your probabilities are. And the only way to do that is to get feedback. And so, for instance, if you make forecasts across 10 different questions and you say there's an 80% probability for all of them, if you're an accurate forecaster, 8 of them will occur and 2 of them will not. That's what accuracy is in a probabilistic world. Okay, so just want to connect. So these are ways to come up with individual discrete forecasts, right? And they can be very helpful to crystallize risk, measure risk. And it turns out we can measure risk, more risk than we thought we could, and we can measure it in more detail than we thought we could. And we can also do it something else. We can connect it to other tools that are out there. For instance, in scenario analysis, the task there is to think of all the possible worlds in the situation that you're trying to understand. It could be this, it could be that. So like in Russia and Ukraine, maybe there's stalemate, maybe Ukraine has the upper hand, maybe Russia has upper hand after a spring offensive. Those are all different scenarios, right? And then sometimes scenario analysis will say which ones are more plausible, right? Try and come up with what sort of makes sense, what sort of holds together, and that's where we should spend our attention. But there's something else you can do and say, well, which ones are more probable? Because just because it's plausible doesn't mean that it's got any probability. And so by connecting discrete small questions to bigger scenarios, you can find out which scenarios are more probable than others. Here's an example. Oh, and there was a write-up too that we did in Foreign Affairs a couple of years ago. Definitely worth a read. And so here's an example that came from last week, where the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, was interviewed. And it was about the future of the US economy. It's a big, important topic. And there are a lot of scenarios out there, right? There's soft landing, hard landing, different kinds of possible landings. And what she concluded was that this year there is a possibility for a soft landing for the United States. Now, she goes into more detail, but still, when you see the word possibility, we're all going to interpret that in very different ways. It's not really an actionable word. It doesn't tell us what the probability is that there's going to be a soft landing. So what do? We can borrow another great tool from scenario analysis and do a 2x2 grid. You've probably seen a lot of these along the way, where you just kind of sketch out different ways that things might unfold. And in this case, let's say growth is strong on the y-axis or weak, and inflation is low on the x-axis or high. And that gives us 4 grids, or 4 different scenarios. And the Goldilocks is kind of the soft landing scenario, where inflation goes down but growth stays reasonably strong. Okay, now how do we tell which of these scenarios is unfolding? What we can do is ask experts, get economists, everybody, policymakers, to say, if we're in this world, what do you expect to see? What kinds of indicators are you going to see? And I just made up a bunch. Services demand and global supply shocks on the y-axis would affect growth. And those things you can measure. Will there be a tightening of the supply chain? You can measure that. Wage and prices on the x-axis for inflation, long-term inflation expectations. Are people expecting inflation to get higher? That would be an indicator that inflation is getting stickier, and you can measure that. And then other things too, you can get like polls from consumers and kind of policy decisions and those sorts of things. Now you've got them all, and you've got small questions now. And then you can pose them to your crowd to find out where those questions are going to be landing. And again, I just made all this up. But this is the way it works. We've done a lot of projects. It works just like this. And you'll get thoughts that will be populating in those different possible scenarios. And you can kind of see, well, in my made-up version, Goldilocks is looking kind of likely. But there's one more thing you can do. You can ask the experts which things are more important than others. And they might say, well, what the Fed is doing is really important. So that should get a heavier weight than what the regulators are going to be doing with regulatory policy, right? So now you've got weights, and you can then see that in this particular stylized example, the Goldilocks scenario is really popping out. You can do one more thing too, and that is you've got probabilities and you've got weights, and you can measure probabilities by weights and turn that into an index. And we've done that a lot too. So you can get even more sophisticated based on that very simple building block of having a forecast question that uses a probability to really inform in very sophisticated ways very consequential decisions. So thank you very much.